I'm going to pick up on a couple of comments that Audrey made. The first is that we shouldn't think of incentives as one single kind of thing. So Audrey made the distinction between incentives, one stream of incentives used to address upstream structural factors, and those tend to be holistic conditional cash transfers, where you're trying to transfer enough money to actually reduce poverty and incentivize some kind of behavior change. The behavior change is usually taking up services. The other stream she described is directly targeting behaviors. Those usually don't transfer as much money. They aren't designed to have an anti-poverty effect per se. They are meant to change a particular behavior. I think this distinction is very important and one to really think about because I think some of the things that we're troubled about on the behavioral level do have structural drivers. It is poverty and poor educational trajectories that increase risk in so many ways. So I don't think anybody in this room would inadvertently want to be working on the behavior in a narrow sense and ignore the structural drivers. On the other hand, we've had years of attempts at changing structural drivers, and the behaviors still get too many young people on trajectories that they really don't want to be on. So how to balance targeted incentives and more holistic incentives, I think, is part of what we're going to do. Linda mentioned that New York City became interested in conditional cash transfers. Mayor Bloomberg, a billionaire mayor who takes $1 a year as salary for governing New York City, is an unusual man. He used to be a Democrat, then he became a Republican. Really, he's neither. He's rich, and which is its own political party. But he is among the most meritocratic leaders of a little democracy that I know of. He really seeks evidence to make decisions, and he is very interested in finding strategies that will not be rejected by the reasonable right and the reasonable left. The unreasonable right and left is never going to be influenced by evidence. The reasonable right and the reasonable left. So another thing I want to say is that I think conditional cash transfers have the potential to garner a level of public, political, and cultural support if they are designed in ways that are scientifically sound, like good medicines and vaccines and things like that, that are legitimately governed, some form of governance oversight of the design of them, I think, is actually a very important feature, and that are community informed. So those three kind of process features I would encourage people to think about. In our experience in New York City, that took a little longer to come up with a conditional cash transfer design, a holistic conditional cash transfer design. But it meant we had buy-in from the health sector, the education sector, the financiers, the equivalent of the Treasury, and nonetheless, the media, when we began doing this work in New York, say Bloomberg wants to bribe the poor to do what they're supposed to do anyway. So at least in the United States, a huge criticism was, why should we pay poor people to do something that they're supposed to do anyway and that we don't have to pay other people to do? And now, not in the STD or sexual transmission of infection area, but just more generally, I used to say, well, when I take my daughter to the pediatrician, I go to the pediatrician and I wait an hour. And I'm a salaried employee, so I only lose an hour's pay, and I'm not threatened with my job. When a domestic worker or a restaurant worker takes their daughter to the clinic, it takes a half a day. They're hourly workers, and they lose 4 hours of work, and if it's a surprise absence, they could lose their job. They pay more to take their daughter to the pediatrician than I do. So we are not bribing the poor, we are trying to make more equal the opportunity costs of doing what we're supposed to do. And it is this concept of equalizing opportunity costs that, at least in the New York context, got us past some of this bribing of the poor. The last thing, two things I'm going to say is I agree with Audrey completely, and I think probably most people on the panel do, that the community forms of government and quasi-government, like big funders, and the research community has to collaborate to work on these over time. We really do need rapid turnaround intervention studies and to develop the evidence base, I think, to do these kinds of things. But they need to be rooted in community and they need to be governed in good ways. So, and my final thing is, you do get benefits outside of areas you expect. So for instance, the conditional cash transfer in New York, the headlines was that it failed because in a year or a year and a half, it didn't change children's achievement test scores. But it reduced poverty, it reduced material hardship, it improved banking, it reduced the rate that loan sharks were exploiting the poor, it increased attendance at health clinic, it increased school attendance, but other than that, it didn't work. So my point is, if you draw too narrowly your outcome criteria for success, you're in some level of vulnerability. And then there are two things that, I'm taking too long, I apologize, I'll shut up. Mechanisms of action. We don't know exactly how some of these things work. We need to start theorizing them. One of the, I now have the grandmother theory, my grandmother theory of conditional cash transfers in New York. My grandmother said if I spent less time hanging around with my friends and fooling around and more time hitting the books, I might do better. That gave us the theory of time use, how conditional cash transfers changing adolescents' use of their time. And we have now been keeping time diaries, which can be very effectively collected on cell phones, time use information. And it turns out that conditional cash transfers in New York shift young people's time away from hanging out with peers after school to hanging out with their family, not on the street, in home, working on academics instead of unstructured time. That has led to reduced substance use of both their peers and themselves. So, and this was going to be an educational conditional cash transfer. So behavior's complicated. There's little behaviors, there's big behaviors, and there's big developmental outcomes. Thanks very much.
Thank